Good evening. I may have told you this before, but a few years ago, our heating and air unit was not functioning properly. And a good friend of mine who I've known since we were little, he does heating and air, and he came out and he said, I can do whatever it is. You're going to charge it in some way. And he said, I can do that for you. He said, but the next time I come, you're going to have to get a new one. And he charged it, and he said it may last a week, it may last a year. It did last. It lasted for a while. But this week, I got my Bible glued and rebound. And she told me about the same thing that he did. I don't think I can do this many more times. So the situation as is that the Bible seems to be pretty good. We're back to, Ephesians, 1st and 2nd, 3rd John. They're all still in play. But maybe going forward, hopefully we'll be able to. Hopefully going forward it'll work. Yeah. And we're going. Y'all gonna get all of those Revelation sermons right here coming real quick. But we are in John chapter 11, and so if you want to go on to that, we can. Last week, some of you, most of you were not, but last week. We did something that we've not really done in our miracle lessons. We split the one that we had to talk about. It was about the third or fourth time that the debate of healing on the Sabbath day came up, and so we addressed that for about half the class, and then we started on Jesus raising Lazarus, and we're going to finish that story this evening. And so we're in John chapter 11. I think we'll start with verse 17 tonight. But I want to look back at what we talked about a little bit last week, because I'm guessing that most of us probably didn't spend every waking hour thinking about it. And so it might be good to have a bit of a refresher course on that for a few minutes before we go any further. But this is the story of Lazarus being raised. We talked about how this takes place in around the side of the Mount of Olives. And this is not a new slide. You saw this last week. But Jairus' daughter and the widow of Nain's son had both took place in Galilee, but this will take place in a small village of Bethany. Bethany was just 2 miles away from Jerusalem, so not very far on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. That is the Mount of Olives in that picture. And we've talked a bit about how that mount is a relative term. They're not mountains like we think about in eastern Kentucky or in Colorado or Wyoming or something like that. But if everything is flat and there's one hill, then you can call it a mountain because it's a mountain compared to everything else. Jesus goes to and from Jerusalem, and he stops at Bethany at the home of Mary and Martha, who were sisters, to rest from his travels. We have seen them already before we get into this conversation. And John will mention that they have a brother named Lazarus, and that's not something that we saw in Luke chapter 10, but it is something that we see in this story. A little bit about Lazarus and a little bit about, again, this is a recap of last week, but Jesus and his disciples had moved into this area. There was concern that they might be attacked, that Jesus could be killed. They said there was a threat of stoning that had existed. And so there was a general worry that Jesus could be killed. And if you're a disciple of Jesus, if Jesus is killed, what may happen to you? You're with him, and they don't like him. They're probably not going to like you either. And so they've moved into this new area. A messenger comes to them and tells them that Lazarus was sick. I think I've got one more slide. That's about where we'll pick up. All right. But we do have an old painting right here. I would like to zoom in because we're actually going to see in the story of Lazarus that one of the people will say that there was a fear that they would smell bad. And if you can see this person right here, it's not super clear, but they have their sleeve kind of over their nose in anticipation. But this is from Duccio di Buoninsegna from about, 710 years ago. So been around for a little while. It's in Fort Worth, Texas. I thought that was kind of the place art ends up is fascinating to me. I do have a couple of questions. I don't feel like we're clicking right. Maybe I'm blocking the way. All right. So these are questions that we had last week. So I'm going to ask you, and we'll refer back to them as well. So again, this is from verse 1 through about verse 16. But Jesus said the sickness of Lazarus was for what purpose? It would allow him for the glory of God. And so Lazarus was sick. You may remember that when they heard about Lazarus' condition, a messenger had came to them telling them, how long did they remain where they were before they went to check on this situation? Well, they stayed a couple of extra days. We'll find out that Lazarus has been dead for 4 days by the time that they get there. But they waited a couple of days. And again, this is not a real far distance from where they were. So it was not, if you have a friend or a relative, well, Maria, you have friends and relatives in New York. If they were to call you and say that they were sick, you've got to make a plan for that. But if somebody lives down the street from you, that's a little easier. So Jesus and his disciples were not far from Lazarus, but they waited a couple of days. Anyway, when Jesus said they would go to Bethany or in Judea to see Lazarus, what does Thomas say to the other disciples in verse 16? We'll just go and die with him. And we talked about that at the end last week, how that they felt pretty confident that this was not a great place to be going to, that they were going to be putting themselves in harm's way, but they were going to go and do it anyway. So that's where we will pick up here this evening. So anybody have questions about that? I know that was a real quick run through, but I wanted to get into the remainder of the lesson. All right. So let's look at, this is John 11, and we're going to read verses 17 through 27. Dad, you care to just read this one?
So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been given the penance for that. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away. And many of the Jews had joined the women around Martha and Mary to come to his brother. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him. But Mary was sitting in the house. Now Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But he said, now I know whatever you ask of God. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection of the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection of the life. Who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. Whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Believe this? I believe the will of God.
All right. So we'll address a few questions here from this. I already kind of gave this away, but we read it as well. How long has Lazarus been in the grave when Jesus gets there? All right, so 4 days. So 4 days is pretty well dead, right? I don't mean that to be crude or anything, but you hear of people that are in medical issues and they're near death, but they can hold on or survive. But 4 days and 4 days buried, there's really no question about whether or not Lazarus would be alive. Why would that maybe be important for this miracle, lesson, discussion, whatever you want to call it? Okay, if he wasn't really dead, you're not really raising someone if they're not really dead. And if he'd been dead for 20 minutes, what might it cause people to say? He wasn't really dead. I'm sure, Michaela, you've probably heard this, but I'm sure doctors and nurses for years have said something like, "Ooh, we thought we'd lost you," or something to that effect. Well, maybe for a brief period, it wasn't good. But you're not going to say that 4 days after the person's they've already died, you've taken them, buried them in the tomb. But this would eliminate any debate on that, I guess we would say. So who comes to Bethany then to comfort Mary and Martha in verses 18 and 19? Yeah, in verse 19, it says that many of the Jews had joined the women around Mary and Martha to comfort them concerning their brother. Once again, to reiterate, and we've talked about this a lot, Jesus was Jewish. Jesus's friends were Jewish. And so this community, and that's what this is, was a group of people that would do the same thing that we would do. Whenever somebody in your family or someone close to you dies, who will most likely come to you? Your friends, the people that are close to you. And that's all we see right here in verse 19 is these are people that they probably went to the temple with, they went to the synagogue with, they would have shopped with, they would have lived near, they would have ate together, whatever it might have been. These are the people that you would expect to come. And so these people come to Mary and Martha here as well. How does Martha express her faith in Jesus? And John, this is verses 20, 21, and 22. Let's just start in verse 20. What happens in verse 20? Yeah. So as soon as she hears she's coming, she goes to meet him, but Mary was sitting in the house. Now let's go to verse 21 then. Martha, what does she say then to Jesus when she comes up to him? Had you been here sooner, he would not have died. Now, is she right? Uh-huh. Okay. Okay. Other thoughts on it? Sure. So what Martha is really saying right here, I really hate that my brother has died. And you, the great physician, the term that's sometimes used, was the only person that could have fixed this. And had you been here, we would have begged you to fix it. And you've already said that you loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus last week, and it would have hurt you to have seen him hurt, and you would have healed. Now, I'm putting words into her mouth right there, but the Bible quotes a sentence, but really she's saying kind of all of that, right? How many of us would have probably said the same thing that Martha said in verse 21? If you didn't say it, you would have thought it, right? That's exactly, if only he had been here. Now, did Jesus really have to be there to have healed Lazarus? We've seen examples of that where it doesn't happen. But what Jesus doesn't tell her, at least not yet, we don't see it, is that Jesus actively chose not to go. Okay? So let's look at then verse 22 right there. But even now, she says what? In verse 22. Now, how would you describe verse 22? If you could describe verse 22 in one word, what would it be? Absolutely faith. Because I don't want to say she's fussed at him, but I think in verse 21, she has expressed her faith in one way, saying, had you been here, I have faith that he'd have been fine. But in verse 22, she expresses her faith in another way. She says, because God will take care of this, right? So she sort of runs the circle on faith in verses 21 and 22. Now, Jesus hadn't spoke yet. Her talking. So the next question. When Jesus told Martha her brother would rise again, how then does Martha again look at her faith? I know what the question says. Let's look at verse 23. What did Jesus say to her after she has said all of that? Your brother will rise again. Now, that's a pretty straightforward statement, but what could that statement mean? That could be resurrection. What else could it be? He could come out of the grave. That's a somewhat vague statement, right? So how does Martha express her faith upon Jesus saying those handful of words? So this is a person who has clearly been listening to what Jesus has been teaching. Now, we have said a few times already, Martha and Mary and clearly Lazarus were friends of Jesus. How many times do you think, and we're just guessing here, how many times do you think these conversations might have been had in a way that we would describe it over coffee or around the dinner table? Do you think they've talked about this before? You almost has to be because of what she says in verse 24. She says, I know he will rise again. He will rise again in the resurrection. So what she is saying right there is, I've been listening to what you were talking about, and I have faith in what you said. Absolutely. She has it seems like maybe she's paid even more attention than some of the apostles had paid, right? It seemed like she really trusted what was about to happen. And so Martha, by what we've read here, she has sort of let Lazarus be dead, right? She's accepted, in a sense, Lazarus is dead, tomb buried, but he will rise again in the resurrection somewhere down the line. Is that what ends up happening? Well, not really. Jesus responds in what way according to her regarding her mention of resurrection? Look at verse 25 and 26. Yeah, he said, I am the resurrection and the life, right? And then he says what? So if he that believes in me, even though he may die, that's happened, he shall live. And he's saying the same thing to Martha and Mary as well, right? Even though you're going to die, all of these people are going to die, but you'll have the opportunity to live again. But in verse 26, he goes a little further by saying what? He who ever lives and believes in me shall never die. Now, what does that mean? Because it seems like that goes against verse 25. Right. We will later be told that it is appointed to man once to die. What? And then what? After that, the judgment. And so it's an accepted fact that we're all going to die. But then you'll live on in heaven, right? So that's what he's saying right here. Can you see where there might be some confusion, though, in what's happening here? Perhaps just a little bit. I think I have one more question I have. Okay. So upon hearing this, what does Martha confess in verse 27? Yep. She says, I believe that you are the Christ, you are the Messiah, you are the Son of God who is to come into this world. Okay. And so she is saying, and the way that she says this makes me think that maybe she hadn't said that before. I don't know. But there is a confession there that we still don't really, what's Lazarus' situation right here? He's still very dead. But we've had this sort of discussion about death and resurrection here between Jesus and Martha. Questions about that? Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Right. 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 There is a level of selfishness in her first statement that we all would have, right? It's only because everyone who has ever passed away, even if they were 100, you mentioned the lady was 101 years old. Well, even if they're 101 years old, you don't want them to die, right? Well, I wish they'd be a little bit longer. So there's this level of selfishness that's there. But she also sort of catches herself by saying, nevertheless, like, Mom, what you were saying, like, that's your call, that's not our call. And so I don't think we are wrong in wishing for people to live longer. And I think sometimes people maybe struggle with that. Like, am I at fault for hoping that my grandmother or grandfather or whomever it might would be, friend or neighbor or coworker? Well, I don't find that there's anything wrong with that. Now, we've probably all uttered a statement like, well, they were in just a condition that was unfixable, that they could not be, made better or something like that. But I don't want you to ever think that you're being selfish and wanting that person, to live even when they are sick. Yeah. All right.
The doctor showed her at 1920, and he got there and left to make it out. 2 years old. And he said, if I did your little brother, that's right, God. Well, I know my grandparents probably had all of a sudden.
Right.
I don't have a copy.
Sure.
Why do we know about it? And that had to be heartbreaking to the 2-year-old child who would say to the doctor. And that's kind of what Mary said.
Right.
You're the doctor.
Right.
You're the victim.
Right. No, I think that, and I think everybody would, I mean, those are common issues with a lot of people. Sometimes we'll hear that, if you'd went to the doctor sooner or whatever it might would be. Let's go a little further. This is John 11, verses 28 through 32. Kevin, do you care to read this, sir?
Then the Jews who were with her in the house accompanied her, and they saw that Mary rose up quickly and ran out, followed her, saying, she's going to the tomb to weep there. Then when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.
Okay. So what did Martha call Jesus when telling Mary he had called for her in verse 28? So Martha, she goes back to Mary. And what is the name, what was the title that she called him, I guess you would say? Mine says the teacher. Does somebody have something different? Master. The King James is master. The other one's teacher. But either one, the same sort of meaning right there. Now, this is an interesting thing to say, I believe. The teacher, the master, has come and is calling for you. Now, who was Jesus to Mary, Martha, and Lazarus? A friend. And so think about your closest friends. You probably refer to them by their name, right? Probably my best friend in the world is Nathan Carrier. I'm probably not going to say, Mr. Carrier is here at the house. I would probably not say that. I would refer to him as Nathan, but probably would refer to him as Nate. We'd dial that back even more. So it's interesting to me here that Martha calls Jesus what to Mary? The teacher, the master. Why do you think she said that? Why do you think she called him that? He had been teaching them. So they were friends, but it still seems like, and we've seen these interactions already, but it seems like that, as you said there, Tom, Boo, you said they recognized sort of what Jesus was doing, and he had been teaching them along the way. And so there's a level of respect that even though he's their friend, he's also capable of maybe more than anybody else would be. So Mary then goes quickly to Jesus. Why do the mourners follow her? Okay. So we've said who were the people that were with them. They were the Jews, the Bible says, but they were there to be with her. And so whenever she packs up and she's going to go over to here, what are they going to do? We've done the same thing with people, right? When people have passed away, we've said, well, what can I do for you? And it's like, well, we need to go and do this. You want me to go with you? I need to be with you in this case. They are friends of her. They are mourning in the same way, in many ways, that we do even to this very day. Oh, one more. And so when she gets to Jesus, what did Mary do and say? And then, does it sound familiar? Look at verse 32. It's almost word for word. What does she say in verse 32? if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And so if you go back to verse 21, Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. They're sisters, both missing their brother, right? And they utter the same thing. They say the same exact thing. Had you been here, he would not have died. Yeah. Absolutely. I think you are 100% correct in that. And that's, I mentioned it at the beginning. I wanted us, because we say those same kind of things. That's why we mentioned it, because I know I wanted you to see then that the second sister says the same thing. What if there had been a third sister or a fourth sister or another brother? What do you think they would have said? I'm sure they would have said the same thing. There were probably Jewish people there that were saying the same thing. They're just not recorded. But these people were all looking at Jesus saying exactly what Dad said a minute ago. If the doctor had been here earlier, this could have perhaps been avoided. John 11, verses 33 to 37. Tom, do you care to read this? Okay. Now, we'll come back to that last verse in just a second. But I want you to go to verses 33, 34, and 35. And I want you to, don't say anything, just read it yourself here. But think about the various actions and emotions of Jesus upon reaching the grave of Lazarus. Mm-hmm. So I want you then to look at verses 33, 34, and 35 and tell me, have you ever done verse 33, 34, and 35? We all have. So let's look at verse 33 the first to start with. Verse 33, therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, talking about Mary, and the Jews who came with her weeping, what does Jesus do in verse 33? Groaned in the spirit and was what? And was troubled. And this is the first emotion that we really see from Jesus in this situation. Now, I'm not saying he didn't have emotion, but how do you interpret groaned in the spirit? What prompted it at the start of verse 33? Seeing Mary crying and the people that were with him. Sometimes we have the ability to sort of put that tough face on, right? But there's people that that when you see them cry, that affects you, right? That affects you. There's, and I don't mean to be harsh, but there are other people that are crying. It maybe doesn't matter. You don't know them. It doesn't, but there are people in your life that you see them and that hurt, and you see Jesus here. It said he groaned in the spirit. What's the back half of verse 33 say? He was what? He was troubled. And how do you interpret that? It did. I think it hurt him that they were hurt. We've seen Jesus deal with death, right? We've seen Jesus deal with injuries, and we've seen Jesus deal with sickness. We've not really seen Jesus show a lot of emotion in these lessons, right? Like there was emotion of go and be healed, but this is something that we see here that we've really not seen from Jesus yet. Why do you think this is when it came out? Tony? They were friends, Tom? Close to, Mom. It was. All of that. Let's go to verse 34 then. And Jesus said, where have you laid him? Right? So Jesus is now asking, where is he buried? We can relate to that, right? We go to the cemetery even to this day. We go to the cemetery for people who have been long since passed and still shed those same kind of tears, right? It's been 50 years, and there's people that are in our family cemetery that I will shed a tear for, and I never knew them. I think about my great grandparents. They've been dead since 1960 and 1965. That was 16 years before I came around. And I still will shed a tear for them because not that they meant anything to me. I didn't know them, but I know what they meant to my father and my aunts and uncle and to my and I know where those stories come from. And so Jesus wanted to go and see that as well. How does he then react when he gets there? Verse 35. That's the shortest verse in the Bible, but shows emotion maybe better than an 100-word sentence could show, right? Because I think all of us could strike Jesus's name out and plug our name in, and it would be the exact same. Verse 38 and 39. Jimmy, do you care to read this? We've still not seen Lazarus be raised yet, right? You know, we've talked about this quite a bit on Wednesday nights. How soon does the miracle tend to happen in these classes? It's usually the right away, and then they fuss and fight and they discuss and they talk and all. Poor Lazarus is still dead, right? But everybody's went through these emotions. Jesus has went through these emotions here as well. So where did they bury Lazarus? In a cave, all right? Now, where will Jesus be buried? In a cave, or is the tomb will be where? What can you maybe take from the Lazarus story and the Jesus story about burials in Israel at the time? That was, the way that people were buried. Why not in the ground? It's too rocky. It's hard to, it's hard to dig them to dig that spot. Even today. Well, maybe not so much today, because we have some instruments that can do it. But a lot of times you'll see those holding vaults. And when people died in cold places in the winter, they couldn't dig a grave for them. They had to be placed in those, and you dig that grave when the spring came and the ground loosened up just a little bit. When Jesus commands that the stone be removed, Kevin, do you have something? Yeah. So I'm going to say yes to both. First of all, we talked about when Jesus drove the pigs into the water. That area, there was all kinds of caves there. There's this rocky area, so there would have been, I think without a doubt, there's going to be different places. But I don't know this, but I would guarantee that there were probably family caves as well. I think that would have been. Yes. That may have just been, it could have. And he seemed to have been fairly well off. Maybe I've got my own cave, but you over here, maybe you don't have as much. You've got to, bury him with other people as well. So Jesus commands, now we're going to get to the raising of Lazarus. We're almost at the very end. But Jesus commands that the stone be removed. And Martha says what in verse 39? She says, Lord, there's going to be a stench because he's been dead for 4 days. Now, today, when somebody dies, we have methods of embalming and all that. You mentioned Scotty passed away today, and the funeral's going to be next Tuesday. That's 6 days is how that's going to be. So I think we can see from what Martha said to Jesus here, the preparation of the body would last. How long do you think? They put the spices and all the stuff to make it smell good. How long is that going to last? Yeah, and that's probably the high end, right? So we probably didn't have these sort of funerals like we have today where there's a visitation. It would have been pretty quick into the grave, because 4 days later, and she's like, it's already going to smell. I don't fault her for saying this, but isn't it interesting that you have faith that a person can bring another person back from the dead, but you don't trust that they'll be able to make them smell good when it's done as well, right? Again, I don't falter for it. I think the same thing, but like the first thought, it's a very human thought. Like, I bet it's going to smell bad, right? Like he's going to walk out of here, but I don't want to be too close to him. He might smell, but it is. I think when we read these stories in the Bible, there are human emotions that still exist with us even to this very day. Sure. Absolutely. Let's see. All right. John 11, this is 40 to 44. Jill, do you care to read this? All right. So Martha expressed concern about a stench. Jesus said in verse 40, what? How did he respond to her concern? He said, did I not say to you that if you will believe, you will see the glory of God? In a sense, Jesus is saying what we said there just a minute ago. It's going to be pretty impressive to see this guy come out of the grave. And you're probably not going to be thinking about a smell when this person comes out of the grave. Right. Yep. You're going to see something far more maybe impressive, far greater than that. So Jesus then prays, or at least we see he lifted up his eyes and say, so I would interpret that as to be praying. But he thanks God for hearing him. Why did he want the multitude to hear? Why do you think he did this? He expresses it in the prayer. Why did he do this? Say that again, Tom. I'm sorry. There you go. This was a teaching moment, right? Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. So a little extra time in the prayer it's not, Lazarus can be raised tomorrow. He can be raised next week if he needs it. But this is an opportunity for Jesus to express what he is doing here. Mary and Martha seem to know, but maybe some of these other people don't know why. After praying, Jesus commands what? Verse 43. He says, Lazarus, come forth, right? Just come forth. That's very simple. 3 words, right? The name and 2 words. Lazarus, come forth. Real simple, right? There's no going into the tomb. There's no, CPR. There's nothing like that, right? There's nothing that he simply says, Lazarus, come forth. And in verse 44, what did Lazarus do? Came forth, right? How would you describe his appearance? What did it say? He was wrapped, bound hand to foot in grave clothes. You're exactly right. His face was what? Basically, he looked exactly like what? Kind of like a mummy, kind of like the picture. He looked exactly like when they put him in there. So there's no Lazarus in there killing time, getting a long weekend out of this. That's not what it is. He's bound up in the clothes. He would have looked like if any other grave you'd went dug up, they'd have looked the exact same way, right? He comes out the same way. Like you said, it did kind of look like the picture that was there. So he comes forth from the grave, Jesus says what after that in verse 44? Loose him and let him go. Last two verses, 45 and 46. Maria, do you care to read these? Do these two verses look familiar? How do they look familiar to you? This has been almost word for word how we've seen nearly every miracle end. We've seen people who had withered arms and who were bent over double and who had diseases. We've seen people raised from the dead, and it said many of those who had come to Mary believed in them, but some of them went away and told the Pharisees what had happened. Now, does this still happen today? You invite someone to church with you. It'll take or it won't take, right? Now, I don't mean that it won't ever take, but people will respond kind of in one of two ways. So I've tried to stress tonight sort of the humanity of everybody involved, but the reality is that humans today sort of do the same thing. And even something as great as this, some people were like, this guy's the real deal. I'm going to hitch my wagon to him. And others were like, need to go tell, right? You'll tell, I don't know if this was the Sabbath day or not. I don't know what the calendar said by this time, but, they fussed about it every other time. So, so who knows right there.
I don't know how they could not believe. You saw it. I don't know how you could be in the camp. I'm not sure about this.
Right.
Looking right at it.
Right.
But a lot of them didn't give up their power.
May have been.
Not necessarily a lot of them, I'm sure it wasn't. But they would have curried favor once they went to tell the Pharisees.
True. It is also fair to say, too, that the Jews believed in resurrection, but not all Jews did. The Sadducees did not. And so this would have been a contradiction of what the Sadducee believe as well. We could have gotten real deep in the weeds right there, and I didn't want to get too deep on it, but there's something to consider as well. All right. Let's take a few things to go home with this evening. First of all, every situation can present an opportunity to teach. How quickly do you think Mary and Martha wanted Jesus to bring Lazarus back? Immediately. But instead, what does Jesus do? Right before he brings him back, what does he do? He prayed, right? He's like, this would be a good opportunity for some people here to see that I am working on behalf of God, on behalf of my Father. Even in a situation like that, it's an opportunity to teach. Sure. That was verse 2. Yeah, absolutely. Second, Jesus is never late. All of us are late from time to time. We might, we have things that sort of slow us down, but we would expect that Jesus would have come running, right? The messenger told Jesus what happened, and we might have thought, my first thought is Jesus would say, it's been 2 days, we need to hustle, right? That's not what he does, right? He does not do that. But he finally arrives, and the sisters say what to him? Had you been, in a sense, what they're saying is, you're late. You could have fixed this. But Jesus knew that Lazarus was dead. This is what you said there, just saying, at the beginning, he said, this will be an opportunity to show the glorify God, right? This will be an opportunity. We might sometimes think that God's a little slow to answer, right? It is, because the want is the selfish part of us, right? Well, we want it done yesterday, but that's not how it works. But sometimes we're better off because it didn't happen yesterday. Sometimes we're better off. And Mary and Martha got their brother back, but half of the crowd got closer to Jesus as a result of it. Jesus could have raised him right then, or maybe never let him die, but those people would have never gathered around if that had happened. The third one, the power of resurrection belongs to Jesus. He admitted this, right? He said this. He said, I am the resurrection. And our response should be, yes, Lord, right? I agree. Yes, indeed. But he has that same compassion for us that he had for Lazarus. And so when we have our sorrows and our frustrations and our negatives, our concerns, whatever it would be, that we would take that to him as well, because our promise has been made to us that when our life is over, what will be there for us? The resurrection, right? It will be there for us as well. And so those are three things to take home with you. I appreciate you working with me for a period and a half here in this. We'll ring the bell now, and class will be over. But any questions before we finish? Yes.
We've got a video, and you and Jessica just went to kindergarten the first day. And after kindergarten, you look one way when you went, when you come home, you look different. The sheriff look. And you've seen the video now.
Uh-huh.
So Jessica says, Mommy's going to get them Mr. Potato Head. She told me she would. And she believed that with all of her heart, and Dale brought her home Mr. Potato Head. I said, well, we need to be like the little Jessica, okay? Jesus, Mom says, and we need to be Jesus coming in me.
Right.
He said,
Right.
That's proof, whatever else you want to talk about. I'll tell you. Jesus said he's going to get it.
Right.
And that's all I have. Because we know it's true.
Thank you all for being active tonight, and I appreciate it that you're willing to bear with me over a week and a half.